In this video, we're breaking down exactly how you can secure funding for your startup in 2025. But first, let's take a look at the bigger picture, how funding flows across Africa and why some countries dominate the investment space. Over the last year, I've been tracking the funding landscape for African startups, and one thing is crystal clear. Most of the money goes to just a handful of countries: Nigeria, Egypt, Kenya, South Africa. And these are the undisputed giants of African startup funding. You see, in 2024, these four countries alone secured 84% of all startup funding in Africa. And while overall investment dropped from 2.9 billion in 2023 to 2.2 billion in 2024, these countries still attracted the lion's share. Now, you see, as a Zimbabwean entrepreneur, wouldn't it be great if we could get a slice of that pie? And the reality is harsh. You see, 99.4% of all startup funding in Southern Africa went to one country, South Africa. And the remaining 0.6%, that's likely just one Zambian startup. So why is this happening? What are investors looking for? And most importantly, how can you secure startup funding in Zimbabwe in 2025? Let's dive in. So, what does the African startup funding landscape look like? Now, I just want to touch on this briefly. Perhaps I'll go into detail in a later video, but for now, I just want to give you a rough outlook. So, according to WeTracker, which is one of the sources I used, 9 countries had significant funding rounds in 2024. So, what I considered significant was funding starting from $50,000 up until upwards of 190 million US dollars. And in number 1, we had Egypt. Egypt raised 190 million US dollars, and they did this from 7 startups. And then we had Uganda, which was the standout, which was the highlight of the year. They raised 176 million US dollars, and the best part is this was from one company, Delight, and the company is called Delight, and it's in the energy sector. I'll probably give more detail in a later video. So there, Uganda is on number 2, and we had the usual Nigeria, South Africa, etc. But there's something I wanna comment on. So on the graph, you can see that there's the UK and the UAE. These 2 countries mentioned here are just the locations of some of these African startups. So these are not UK startups. These are startups started by Africans, but in the UK and in the UAE. So this is just something I wanted to make known. And when we break it down further by the number of startups receiving funding in each country, we see a similar pattern. So Egypt had 7 startups, Kenya 7 startups, Nigeria 5 startups, South Africa 3 startups. And these are just the startups that received funding last year. So these are not the total number of startups in the country. These are just probably the new ones, you see, or the ones that were fundraising last year. So similar pattern. The big 4 have the most startups, and then we have Uganda, Ghana, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Morocco. But let's get more specific. You see, if you're a Zimbabwean entrepreneur looking for funding, it's crucial to understand which industries are attracting the most capital. So from the data, key sectors leading in investment include fintech, electric vehicles, energy and environment, e-commerce, and logistics. Now, what about the type of investment? So most funding falls under equity financing, debt financing, grants, or hybrid financing. So equity financing is where investors take a stake in the business. Debt financing is where startups borrow money, and then that money has to be repaid. Then you have grants, which are rare, but they provide non-repayable funds to early stage businesses. Grants are usually from the government or from non-governmental organizations. And then hybrid financing is basically any combination of these 3 that I mentioned. And as you can see, debt financing seems to be the most popular, with an excess of 250 million. And then you have equity financing, which is about close to 250 million, and then the rest are not as common compared to debt financing and equity financing, and I feel like that's the case for financing a startup across the world. So I feel like these trends are in line with the rest of the world. Now, if you have a startup or if you're thinking of starting one, it's important to realize and to understand who is funding these startups. So the data shows that most of these startups are being funded by foreign investors, and most of these investors are not widely overlapping between countries, meaning there's an abundance of untapped capital looking for opportunities. Basically, you won't find one big investor investing in multiple startups across Africa. No, what you'll find is you'll find many investors investing in many different startups across Africa. Basically, in that sense, there's less competition. In fact, in Africa, there is less competition because, like I mentioned before, we only have 9 countries that are actively producing startups year on year. Now, let's talk about how you as a Zimbabwean entrepreneur can secure funding. Despite the challenges, there are several options available. Number 1, government funding options. So we have the Mutapa Investment Fund. This is Zimbabwe's sovereign wealth fund designed to invest in various sectors, including startups, with a focus on economic growth and development. Then we have the National Venture Capital Company of Zimbabwe. So this provides equity financing to startups and SMEs, offering incubation, acceleration programs, and private equity investments. Then, number 2, we have private venture capital firms. So I'll just list 2 here. Number 1, we have Vakayi Capital. This invests in sectors like healthcare, clean energy, housing, and education, supporting outstanding entrepreneurs providing essential services. Then we have Takura Capital Partners. So they focus on investing in Zimbabwe's businesses, particularly in the SADC region, fostering economic growth. And number 3, we have angel investors and crowdfunding. So you could use Angel Match, which is a platform that connects entrepreneurs with angel investors and venture capitalists in Zimbabwe. You could also look into non-governmental organizations. You could look into banks, Afrexim Bank, for example, the Development Bank, African Development Bank, rather. You could also look into various options as well. This was just to give you an outlook on how the space looks in Africa and what's getting funding in Africa. So I listed the industries that are getting the most funding from outside investment, how to get this investment, the types of investments that you can get, the types of fundraising rather. So it could be equity financing, debt financing. So this is just a rough outlook on how the space looks like. It's a very young and developing space. It's been growing year on year since COVID, and we're seeing growth year on year. So hopefully Zimbabweans are able to join in on the fun and come up with new ideas and new investments. So while Zimbabwe may not yet be attracting the same level of investment as its African counterparts, there's still plenty of opportunities. And by leveraging these funding sources and understanding what investors are looking for, you can increase your chances of securing the capital that you need to scale your startup. So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you next time. Wanga muri pipa ndai